Hi everyone, it is E. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking every episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Avatar: The Last Airbender is my favorite TV show of all time. I've probably seen each episode at least 8 or more times. I got into the show in middle school while it was airing, probably around the beginning or middle of book 2, and since then I've really loved this show. So without further ado, let's get on into the ranking. Number 61 is The Great Divide. Most people really don't care for this episode. It's kind of a filler episode, and it doesn't really add a lot to like the world building or character development, and it's just kind of stupid. That being said, it's still fun to watch and a good episode. Number 60 is The Chase. I don't really care for the arguing between Katara and Toph that takes place all throughout the episode, which is kind of like the underlying the underlying conflict, so I don't really care for that one very much either. Then number 59 is the Avatar State. It's got that crazy general who's trying to get Aang forced into the Avatar State so he can use him as a weapon. The episode's just kind of annoying. The general gets on my nerves. The story is kind of boring. It's kind of cheesy. The best thing about this episode is it's really the first time we get to hear Azula speak. And so that makes it a cool episode. Then next up, this is 58, would be The Desert. This episode's really sad because Aang is grappling with the loss of Appa having been kidnapped and sold. And so I really don't like that. It's sad to watch. And I think Aang acts kind of poorly in the episode. Like, I understand he's in a lot of stress, but he acts like a jerk anyway. But Sokka tripping on the cactus juice makes the episode really funny. Next up, number 57 is Bato of the Water Tribe. This episode I don't care for as much because I really don't like, again, how poorly Aang behaves. And it's kind of awkward. Also, I don't really like the episodes that have a lot of adults in them, like Bato playing a huge role, and not because I don't like the adults in the universe, it's because they're so, like, strangely tall. Like, Bato looks like he's 7 feet tall when he's standing next to Sokka, who you would assume would be, like, a normal height, almost adult. But anyway, that's a weird nitpick. Next up is The Beach. This one is a filler episode. It doesn't add a lot to the story. It's got some humorous moments, which I enjoy, but otherwise, like, it is kind of awkward watching Azula fail to socialize with her peers. Next up is The King of Omashu from Book 1. This episode is introducing Bumi to us, which I really like Bumi as a character, so that's cool, but the challenges are silly and the lighting is odd throughout the episode, so everyone looks green the whole time, which is weird. I know that's a really weird reason to dislike an episode, but it's a little bit more cartoony than a lot of the other episodes are. Next up is The Painted Lady. I like this episode for, like, Katara kind of taking on a alter ego, like a secret identity type of thing, which is really cool. But again, this is just like a filler episode. And I like Avatar's filler episodes, so it's not to say I don't like these episodes that are ranked closer to the bottom. I do like them. It's just, obviously the filler episodes aren't as interesting as the other ones. And I think, again, Aang and Katara are helping out this village, but at the same time they're acting pretty irresponsibly and not thinking it through, like Sokka said, and so that irritates me. Next up is The Awakening. This episode, again, has kind of an awkward conflict. I really don't like the episodes where Aang decides that he just wants to pout and be by himself, which a lot of these episodes are him pouting and wanting to be by himself. It's like, it's a lesson that he has to keep learning over and over again, that, like, he needs to process his emotions with other people. And then also Katara acts like a whiny person in this episode. Like, I understand her heartache over, missing her father, but now he's back and she's kind of taking it out on him, which, I don't know, is odd. It's an odd episode with an odd tone. Next up is Return to Omashu. In this episode, we get to really see Ty Lee and May in full force. And With this episode, it kind of shows Azula's true colors. She basically tells May that she needs to basically give up her little brother, and I think that that's when the seeds of doubt are sown in May for her later betrayal of Azula. I don't know, the episode, I don't really care for it. It feels like a filler episode, even though it's not. The Pentapox subplot is cheesy. Next up is a fortune teller. This episode I actually do like, but I rank it low for personal reasons. Just because I don't really like fortune telling, for one thing, and for another, it kind of implies that Katara and Aang are going to wind up together, which they do, but because I don't really like them together that much, I don't like it. Sokka is the highlight of this episode. Next up is the Northern Air Temple. The reason I don't really care for this one, and it's ranked fairly low, is because of the conflict in the episode. Makes me feel uncomfortable that these people who are not bad people have basically desecrated like sacred sites that they didn't realize were sacred. So it's like they were acting badly, but they didn't understand how or why. And Aang kind of flips out on them and is rude to them, which it's understandable because it's the culture of his people and all of that. But I do like this episode a lot because it's very early on in the show, and you get to see this invention of the war balloon, and you think, like, is this ever going to come back and play? And it doesn't really show back up in the show for like 2 more seasons. So it's really cool to see those little nuggets of information deposited all throughout the show. Next up is Imprisoned. This episode shows Katara up on her high horse again, which, I mean, I really like her. She's a strong character and all that, but once again, she's kind of acting recklessly, and it does pan out for them in the end. And this is the episode where she loses her necklace. So there's a lot going on in this episode that's kind of irritating. Next up is Nightmares and Daydreams. This episode's really funny, and I like it a lot for that reason, but it is a filler episode, and it's kind of silly. Next up is Avatar Day. This is the episode where Aang is put on trial for things that he did in a past life as Kyoshi. This episode is really, really funny, and I like how Kyoshi just shows up at the end and like, yeah, I murdered him, what of it? It's very funny, and I like it for that reason, even though it's really goofy. Next up is Appa's Lost Days. I think this is a really, really, really well done episode, but it is just so sad, and that's why it's not rated higher. Next up is The Swamp. I'm not a big fan of the super mystical stuff, but the way it's handled in this episode is pretty cool. I think it's a little odd that like little thing that the swamp guy Hugh shows him, where he like puts his hand down on the banyan grove tree and like that little lightning bolt shoots out and Aang's able to figure out where Appa is. Like, that doesn't really come back up that much except for in the episode The Guru, and that's really a useful skill. So is it just like you can only do it in the swamp, or if you're a big time mystical guru, or is that something Aang could do all the time but just is continuously forgetting to do? So for that reason, that little, I guess it's not a plot hole, but it's just something that's not very well explained. That's why it's not ranked higher, but the humor of like the swamp people is really funny. Next up is the Southern Air Temple. This episode is very uncomfortable and sad, but it's handled really well. And yeah, it's interesting to get these little pieces of lore early on in the show. Next up is The Deserter. This is the first episode that Aang ever firebends in, so that makes it really cool. And the concept of there are good people from the Fire Nation who don't agree with the war is important. So I like it for those reasons. It does, again, there's that uncomfortable moment where Aang burns Katara's hands, and it's really upsetting. But of course the episode ends on a note of humor with Sokka chastising Katara for not providing first aid over the years, since apparently she's always known how to heal. And then next up is Jet. This episode is really cool. Jet is a really interesting character. Obviously, I don't like him because he's kind of this vigilante type person who just seeks justice on his own terms, which is obviously not the way that justice should be dealt. But he's a really cool character. The tree house that they live in is really cool and beautiful and well designed. So there's a lot of really cool stuff in this episode. Next up is the Firebending Masters. This is a really important episode for Zuko to understand, where the true source of firebending is and all that kind of stuff. But it's not that interesting to me. And it's kind of like just lucky that this society has been able to keep secret for all this time. And I feel like sometimes episodes like this raise more questions than they answer. So for that reason, it's not ranked higher. Next up is the Earth King. This episode, there's not a lot to it, honestly, but it's important to the plot, so I do like it for that reason. It really moves things along. Next up is the Puppet Master. This episode, again, is kind of a filler episode. It aired originally around Halloween, which is cool, so it's a kind of a spooky episode. While it is a filler episode, it also has such a huge element with the bloodbending that comes back into play later in this show and then even in the spin-off Legend of Korra. So it's a really important episode for the Avatar universe. Next up is City of Walls and Secrets. This episode is really cool. I like the little espionage of them sneaking into the fancy party and finding out what is really going on in Ba Sing Se. The next episode is The Boy and the Iceberg. This episode really is kind of slow and there's not much going on, but I really do enjoy it as an introduction to the characters. We already get to get a good sense in just this very first episode of who Katara and Sokka are, what kind of person Zuko is, getting to hear his voice for the first time, and stuff like that. But I do like the second part, The Avatar Returns, a little bit better because there's a little bit more action in it. And so I rank that one a little bit higher. Next up is the Waterbending Scroll. I really like the pirates. They're very cool villains. They don't play a huge role in the series, but they do come back into play a little bit later in this season. For the finale, I enjoy Zuko in this episode. He is a really good villain type in this episode. And bartering with Katara's necklace and everything. It's a really cool and dramatic scene. And from then is when I really started shipping them. It's like, oh, it's wrong, but it's right, that kind of a thing. So I really like this episode for that reason. Next up is the Spirit World. This is the first part of kind of the mid-series finale. And it is cool to see Aang's first dealings with the Spirit World and that side of things. And next up is Avatar Roku, which is the second part of that. I like this part a little bit better than the first part because we get to hear Avatar Roku really speak to Aang for the first time. It's also kind of humorous because Aang has to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get to speak with Roku for the first time, I guess because he really doesn't understand how to access his past lives yet. But later on, in the episode Avatar Day, Kyoshi just rolls up out of nowhere and just speaks to everybody just like that. And it's funny how Aang's past lives work. So I like this episode for that reason. Next up is the Tales of Ba Sing Se. I rank this pretty highly because the little stories are very cute. They're all kind of fillery, but they all show so much characterization. We get to see a sweeter side of Zuko, who is really risking his safety in Ba Sing Se to please this girl that he doesn't know very well. It really starts to show him as a good person inside, but just needing to draw that out. And obviously the most heartbreaking part is Iroh's story, which I've seen this episode so many times that I've kind of steeled myself. I don't cry when I watch it anymore, but I used to cry almost every time I watch this episode for that reason. Next up is The Storm. This episode is really good, I think, for finally showing us a little bit more of the background of what happened to Aang and why he ran away, why he was in the iceberg in the first place. And then, of course, getting to hear Zuko's backstory is really important as well. This episode kind of comes along sort of later in the first book than you would think it would. And that's kind of what makes it interesting to me. It's like this information you feel like would have been useful earlier on, but the way that they held it back from us till this point is really cool. And I really love the way that the information is portrayed. Next up is Bitter Work. The subplot of Zuko trying to learn lightning redirection from Uncle Iroh is incredible. Like, that's one of my favorite B plots of all time. And it culminating with Zuko shouting up into the sky at the end is awesome and hilarious. The plot between Aang and Toph is a little bit different. Like, I don't like that part as much, but it's still really funny that with, Sokka dug up in that hole and unable to escape. So that's really fun. Next up is The Warriors of Kyoshi. This is the 4th episode of the whole show. I like it as it introduces Suki and the elite class of female warriors known as the Kyoshi Warriors. So I really like this episode for that. And it's basically like Sokka is a sexist up until episode 4 of the show. And then after this episode, he like flips totally. Like Suki totally like just changed his life. And he doesn't really exhibit any of that or much of that sexism ever again. Maybe in very small moments, but overall, this episode really did a lot to evolve Sokka's character, and Sokka being one of my favorites, that's why I like this episode so much. Next up is The Drill. This episode has a lot of like fun and interesting drama. It really shows Sokka is a good planner. It's got good teamwork between all members of Team Avatar, and for that reason, I really like it. Next up is Lake Laogai. I really like this episode for showing more of the conspiracy in Ba Sing Se. And it's really got this cool, creepy atmosphere to it. And of course, this is a great episode because finally Appa and Aang are reunited and Zuko does a good thing, a good deed. So that's cool. Next up is The Headband. This is one of the first episodes. It's actually the second episode of season 3 or book 3. And we really get to see, it's kind of, again, a filler episode, but I really like this one because it gets to show us what the people of the Fire Nation are like. That they're not all like evil warmongering people. They're just normal people who don't really understand what's going on in their world and what's going on outside of the Fire Nation. And it's kind of a footloosey kind of episode, and it's really fun. Next up is The Avatar and the Fire Lord. This episode is from book 3, and it shows us the origins of the war from Aang and Zuko's perspectives learning about it. And it's really cool to see Zuko learning that his 2 great-grandfathers are basically on the opposite sides of things, and Iroh kind of showing to Zuko that he can play a role in ending the war. Next up is The Ember Island Players. I really like this episode because it's probably the best recap episode I've ever seen in a TV show ever. To kind of go over all of the events of the TV show, but not just showing us like clips, but actually animating a whole play. So it's a really cool episode, and I think it's a really cool flip of the formula of a recap episode. Next up is Sozin's Comet Part 4. This is my least favorite of the 4-part finale, even though it kind of has the final climactic ending where Katara chains up Azula and Aang finally beats Ozai, but it's not got the most dramatic part of either of those battles to me, so that's why I rank it kind of low. And then the resolution or the afterward where it's all over and there's a couple of scenes of what happens after that. None of those scenes are very satisfying to me. Like Zuko going to his father's cell and asking where his mother is, but us not really getting to see any of the aftermath of that is a little bit bothersome. The next episode would be Sozin's Comet Part 1. I don't like this part that much because it shows Aang going into that trance and like running away. Like, he doesn't do it voluntarily, but still it's frustrating to watch the rest of them have to figure out where Aang is, which is really not what they should be worried about. Then the next is Sozin's Comet Part 2. I love this episode for getting to see Zuko and Iroh reunite with each other. I don't like it quite as much as the Southern Raiders, though, which is next up on my list. I really do like this story. Finally, we get to see Katara and Zuko reconcile once and for all. Next up is The Runaway. I really like this episode. Again, it's a filler episode, but this kind of gets to see the resolution of that initial argument between Katara and Toph that happens in the chase. It kind of comes to its end in this episode. So I really like it for that reason. Like, all of the things that make me uncomfortable about Toph and Katara's relationship are finally, like, resolved in this episode. And it's really funny. Like, there's some scenes in here where, like, Toph and Aang and Sokka are basically committing insurance fraud, and it's really funny. Next up is the library. I really like this episode because of just the set design of the library is really cool. That celestial projection room is really interesting. The calendar, which shows the positioning of the heavenly bodies, is really interesting, and it finally gets us some headway in the war on a whole. And it's really cool because this is happening in the middle of book 2, and the full implications of what they learn in this episode don't come to fruition until the middle of book 3. So again, it's one of those cool episodes where a little seed of information is deposited and we don't get to see the full result of it until later. Next up is The Boiling Rock Part 2. I really like this part and part 1. They kind of go together. I really can't say I like one part more than the other. This 2-part episode is amazing. Sokka and Zuko are my 2 favorite characters. Watching them work together in this prison is amazing. Some of the scenes with the prisoners are actually pretty funny. I think that this is Sokka at some of his best, and I love that about it. And the fight between Sokka and Zuko and Azula on top of the gondola at the end, showing how Zuko and Sokka are really working together in a true team, like, it's incredible. Like, the transformation of their relationship, love it. Next up is The Serpent's Pass. This is the first of a 2-parter. The second part was the drill, which I didn't like as much. The Serpent's Pass, honestly, it's hard for me to say why I like this episode so much. I think that this relationship between Sokka and Suki kind of coming along is really cute. It's fun to watch their relationship evolve over the course of this episode. And then also watching Toph get jealous of that is very cute. The crush that Toph has on Sokka is one of my favorite little underlying features of the show. And the drama is pretty good in terms of, like, the battling basically with the serpent and all that kind of stuff. Next up is The Guru. This episode I really like because the book 2 finale is some of the best TV I've ever seen. The Guru, I really like his personality. I really like how he helps Aang, but it is a little frustrating to watch Aang abandon his training, I guess, to go help Katara. In the end, he changes his mind in the Crossroad of Destiny and takes his role in the world seriously, and then does decide that he should let go of Katara to achieve the Avatar state. But watching that kind of explanation in this episode is really cool. And then also getting to see Sokka reunite with his father is important. So there's a lot going on in this episode to enjoy. Next up is The Day of Black Sun, Part 1. So, this is the invasion plan. Obviously, it fails. Part 1 sees them making this progress. It's really cool to see all of these people we've met along the way come back, so I really like this as kind of a reunion episode. But it's not super forced. A forced reunion. It's very natural to have all of these characters returning. Next up is Zuko Alone. Zuko Alone is probably one of the best episodes of this show. I love watching Zuko struggle with right and wrong, and really this is another episode that shows that he is a good person. He's just conflicted over what good and bad is. Next up is The Day of Black Sun Part 2. I like this part better than Part 1 because there's a lot more drama involved. We really get to see Zuko just letting Ozai have it, and telling him that he's running away to go help the Avatar. Like, that's incredible. The fight with Azula is very, very frustrating, but it's still cool. So there's a lot of interesting and cool things going on in this episode. Toph particularly is very fun to watch. basically helping them navigate through those underground tunnels. I love her as a character, and this is Toph at her finest. Next up, speaking of Toph, is the Blind Bandit. Love this episode for introducing Toph's character. It perfectly kind of explains who she is as a person, so we, moving forward, can comprehend all the decisions that she makes and the way that she acts. And also, the Boulder is hilarious. Earth Rumble 6 is hilarious. There's a lot of really great humor woven into this episode, and Toph is amazing. Next up is the Blue Spirit. This is one of my favorite episodes from book 1. The plot of Aang trying to get the frogs for Sokka and Katara to get well is very funny. There's a lot going on in this episode. Sokka and Katara are funny as they're struggling with being sick and kind of acting delusional. And Aang just trying to focus on getting these frogs. Even while he's being kidnapped, he is single-minded on getting his friends well again. And then Zuko obviously being this blue spirit who is a traitor to the Fire Nation. It all just makes so much sense. And in that moment where Aang asks if they had been friends before the war started 100 years ago, if they could have been friends, it just really hits you right where you live. Next up is the Waterbending Master. I love this episode. For one thing, Sokka and Yue kind of got a cute little thing going on, which is going on in the background. But then, more importantly, Katara and Pakku having this conflict over this sexist traditional society. And then in the end, Pakku coming around, partly because of his, I think he's doing it for Gran, because he loves Sokka and Katara's grandmother. But also I think that part of it is he just changes his mind once he sees what a powerful fighter Katara is. So it's really cool. Next up is the Western Air Temple. This episode is just so funny and so cute. Like Zuko trying to be a good guy and failing. And then obviously we have Sparky Boom Man finally meeting his end. I love Sparky Boom Man. So that's really amazing and cool too. Next up is the Cave of Two Lovers. The hippie nomads in this episode are so hilarious. I don't know what it is. This episode is just so funny to me. And in terms of humor, this is top tier Avatar to me. And I love the songs in this episode, so I rank it very highly. Next up is Sokka's Master. Sokka is my favorite character. This episode really displays his skills. I like the conversation that he has between the other members about them encouraging him to pursue this, and making sure that he knows that they don't see him as weak because he's not a bender. I just really like this episode, showing what supportive friends really look like, and then also showing Sokka's strengths. Next up is Siege of the North Part 1, which I don't like quite as much as Siege of the North Part 2. But as a two-parter, it's a really excellent finale. The whole thing with Yue becoming the moon spirit is amazing. Us learning that Zhao was in the library, and then the library coming back into play later is incredible. We finally really get to see a little bit more of who Iroh really is, that he is not that interested in war. He's there in interest of peace, and he only agreed to be Zhao's general because he wanted to be able to oversee what was going on. We learned that Iroh has apparently been to the spirit world before. Zuko swimming underwater with those sea lions to break into the city, kind of showing his weird intelligence. There's just a lot going on. And it's a really good two-part finale. Next up is the Crossroads of Destiny. We see Katara and Zuko in that little cave together. Oh, what a scene. Love that. And then, of course, the fight is amazing. Iroh and Aang having that honest conversation about, what is better, perfection and power or love. There's a lot of really cool elements to this episode. Obviously, it ends very tragically, but, I feel like that drama makes it even better. And of course, we know that Aang doesn't die at the end of the episode. We just know he's injured. and that Ba Sing Se has fallen. And so it leaves us in this really like tense moment of, well, where are we going from here? And my favorite episode of all of Avatar: The Last Airbender, number 1, is Sozin's Comet Part 3. This is where we have the most tense moments. We have the moment where Sokka and Toph are hanging off the edge of the airship wondering, are we about to die? And that's basically what Sokka says, and then Suki is able to come and save them. That moment there makes me cry when I watch it, because I just, like that emotional, tensity, seeing that tear stream down Toph's face, Sokka holding on for life and holding on to Toph with all that he has. It's amazing. And then, of course, this is the part where we see the majority of the Agni Kai between Azula and Zuko. That's an amazing scene. The music is so sad. So you think you're gearing up to watch this incredible showdown, but then there's everything about the way that it's cast is really depressing. That like these two siblings are fighting each other when they shouldn't be. They're both like basically victims of this war and of their father's harsh treatment. That's an incredibly well done scene. And then of course, this is where there's the most tension in the fight between Ozai and Aang. I mean, this is when the fight starts between Ozai and Aang, and the fight is really cool to watch. Part 4 basically shows us Aang in the Avatar state. So this is basically the fight before Aang taps into the Avatar state, so there's a lot of tension in there. So that is why it is my favorite part of the finale, and also probably my favorite episode of the whole show. But all that to say, every single episode on this list, all 61 episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender, are really good television. Even The Great Divide, which is my least favorite, I still enjoy watching. So you'll have to let me know what you think. What are your favorite episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender and why? And with that, I will see you all later. Bye-bye.